everyone should sort of brand like a cow iron into their brain somewhere, which is this concept of the whole of society censorship framework. Now, they will call it the whole of society counter misinformation or counter disinformation framework, but it's censorship. They're not countering it through speech, they're countering it through remove, reduce, inform, all censorship techniques. Now, the whole of society framework is getting 4 different categories of institutions to all work in concert with each other as if they are the nucleus of a single cell. And that is government institutions, private sector institutions, civil society institutions, and news media and fact checkers. This is not my framework, this is theirs. I can play you a 20-minute supercut of them invoking this like a mantra. It looks like a weird scene out of Eyes Wide Shut when you hear them all get in their incantation, whole of society, whole of society. But just to flesh out, for example, what this means in a U.S. context, and I guarantee you in every country of your concern, you will see this exact same phenomenon with this exact same constellation. Just substitute the names for the government agencies, for example. So on the U.S. side, in the government, as I mentioned, you have DHS, FBI, DOD, Department of State, National Science Foundation, which is basically just the civilian arm of the Pentagon. You have specific agencies that are now given, as part of their democracy mandate, censorship of their particular field of expertise. For example, you'll have misinformation grants being given out by the Department of Energy, or you will have COVID censorship grants being given out by our Health and Human Services Department. You now have White House coordination of this with the Biden administration. That was something that was not there during the Trump era, but that is now something that we're dealing with. On the private sector side, these are the tech platforms itself. That is where the censorship actually happens, which means they need liaisons. They need personnel at these tech platforms, because personnel is policy. To get these policies done, you need pressure on the senior level, and you need implementers at the sort of mid-level at the trust and safety staff teams. Then you have these private sector censorship tool developers. These are private companies like NewsGuard and many others. There's a sort of nuclear arms race for the best weapon of mass deletion. And they're competing not just for sort of private grant donors from the Craig Newmarks and Pierre Midyars of the world, but they're competing for hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. grants. This is actually how we busted the Stanford Internet Observatory, was because they were competing by 2021. They were competing with so many other censorship labs and private censorship firms for government funding, for National Science Foundation funding, that they had to brag publicly about what they were doing in order to be the tallest dandy in the field. And you see this everywhere. They need, because the field is so competitive and they're all competing for the same grant pool, they need to stand out to be the best censor in class, which means they need to brag about the censorship work they do. Another player in this, which doesn't really get covered much, but is an interesting thing to observe, and especially on a country-by-country basis, is the corporate social responsibility and funding and capacity done by private sector corporations like Microsoft or Google, or there's a dozen companies, and some of these are region-specific. But when the U.S. State Department wants to overthrow a country or regime change or stave off a political insurgency, oftentimes the business and corporate interests in that region will have an interest in stabilizing that regime or overthrowing that regime. And so they will co-partner with the State Department or USAID, or in the case of Europe, one of the ministries of foreign affairs, in doing so. And so when you see, for example, a corporation involved in this that you think, what are they doing here? Understand that there are these partnerships. They will essentially be co-investors in the operation to secure the political ecosystem that will maximize their financial profits. On the civil society side, you have universities, NGOs, essentially state, these blob preferred activist groups, community leaders, and nonprofits and foundations. Universities are a major hub for this, because the academics in universities have this long interplay with the national security state itself. They get their funding through government organs and grants. In the U.S. alone, there's over 60 U.S. universities who are just getting National Science Foundation grants for censorship work. Total is about $100 million just from one government agency to all these universities to do this. They essentially serve as a censorship mercenary army, but parked out of academia as a front. And then you have news media and fact checkers, which is essentially this coordination into this consortium of favored news outlets in the region and fact checker groups. And the news outlets do a few interesting things. A lot of this consortium is designed in order to create pressure on the tech platform side of this, to the extent that the tech platforms are not fully captured or they get squeamish about going too far on one thing. And part of the role of onboarding civil society is to have a non-governmental organization, a sort of gongo, a sort of super gongo in a university, create the map of who to be censored, provide that to the media. The media creates news cycles about it. That threatens the advertisers and the revenue of the platform, and between the financial pressure from the advertisers and the black PR and the government pressure and threats of coercion and favors for favors that private sector companies rely on, it creates an offer you can't refuse. And I heard yesterday that there was some hesitation about the conspiratorial aspect of looking at the government's role in censorship. And I'd like to use whatever remaining time I have to kind of demystify that. And it's really, in a sense, it's a huge deal because it's kind of the end of the world. But it's also not a huge deal in the sense that this is actually ordinary course activity that the State Department, the USAID, the UK Foreign Office, British intelligence services have done forever in so many other fields, but it just hasn't been subjected to our domestic countries. But when you understand the structure of it, so this is the disinformation primer of USAID. USAID was created in 1961 when the CIA, the State Department, and the Department of Defense were all tripping over each other with providing money to CIA-backed dissident groups or to DOD-backed paramilitaries or to State Department grantees. So they centralized it all in a giant front called USAID. USAID is not a charity, doesn't do charity work. It's a soft power influence mechanism. Just want to note here just a few things quickly, which is that this USAID primer from 2021 mentions 31 times in 91 pages how to cut financial support, to cut off advertiser revenue to news media organizations, and to put financial pressure on the tech platforms in order to kill mis and disinformation. This is something I really want to stress because Globsec was mentioned yesterday, I believe, in the Czech Republic presentation. And I pulled this from a Globsec presentation in May 2017. May 2017. So this is prior to this giant capacity building in 2018. This was during this consensus building period that I referred to in the timeline, where you had these players all getting together in a panic about the end of the world because Brexit was going to cause Frexit and it'll exit and Grexit. The EU was going to come undone. NATO was going to come undone. We'd never win an election again. The rules-based international order would fall apart. There'd be no enforcement arm for the IMF. It would be like the end of Fight Club. All the credit card companies burned to the ground and the right-wing populists rule the world. And so this freaked the shit out of them. Sorry, the poop out of them. And so here what you have in May 2017. So again, this is just 4 months after the inauguration of Donald Trump. You had Christopher Walker, who ran the intelligence wing of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the top CIA cutout in the entire 10,000 strong arsenal of the Central Intelligence Agency. In May 2017, and I was told that you can't play the audio, but it's really an amazing thing. In this clip, you have the four main players that you see right there are Christopher Walker, from the National Endowment for Democracy, from the CIA, Michael Chertoff, who was the first full-time head of the Department of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009 under President Bush. He then became head of Freedom House, which is one of these free speech, essentially CIA fronts in order to allow our State Department-backed dissident groups to have an independent media ecosystem so that they can win elections. Michael Chertoff also became the interim head of the Disinformation Governance Board after Nina Jankowicz was forced to step down. He was actually one of the thought leaders behind the creation of the Disinformation Governance Board in the first place. He's a major player in all this. And who he's flanked by on both sides are the heads of public policy, which is where censorship policies are, for Central and Eastern Europe, of Google and Facebook. So you have the CIA and you have the domestic censorship promulgator bringing together the head of potential censorship for Google and Facebook, getting them in a room at Globsec in Slovakia, and telling them, you had better start to change the economics of the news industry in response to Donald Trump winning the 2016 election. What's really amazing is, in this, I heard you guys talking about the Gutenberg printing press, and they brought up that same thing at this very conference in May 2017, where they said, we found a way to stop it before. Yes, the printing press allowed Nazis to print propaganda, but we stopped it before by using these various methods. we can stop the rise of right-wing populist parties on the internet now. And just so you understand how they framed the issue themselves, this is the Globsec YouTube page. In 2017, traditional media are being challenged by the plurality of internet news sources. And by the way, Christopher Walker was not former NED at the time. He was current. But you had a current, effectively CIA official cornering Facebook and Google in the room, who were very squeamish in this, I should add, that traditional media are being challenged by the plurality of internet news sources and social networks. More internet users are relying on the abundance of unfiltered alternative media that often spread fake news or propaganda. Search engines and social media work with algorithms. Research shows that populist and extremist right-wing groups excel in abusing these algorithms that amplify their propaganda and spread like a virus across the internet. Now, at the time, they were talking about Brexit and Trump. The actual intro tape that they played was the evolution of extremism from Hitler to Trump. It was literally a montage that started with the printing press, and then it went to World War II, and then it went to sort of Stalinism, and then it went to Brexit, and then it went to Trump. I mean, this is literally a NATO cabal plotting to change the economics of the news industry in 2017, right at the birth of, the other thing they noted, again in 2017, which would sort of become codified in this whole society doctrine, is this again from the National Endowment for Democracy Intelligence Head. I feel that in the absence of really concerted collaboration across sectors urgently, we will not be able to meet this challenge, this censorship challenge. And right away, to the rescue swoops this new class of censorship mercenary firms, like, for example, NewsGuard. This is in 2018, mid-2018. This is before NewsGuard had even launched its first commercial product. NewsGuard is one of the nastiest censorship mercenary firms of them all. On their board is General Michael V. Hayden, former head of the CIA, former head of the NSA, former four-star general. Anders Fogh Rasmussen is on their board of advisors, former head of NATO. Rick Stengel, the former head of the Global Engagement Center of the State Department, is on their board. Tom Ridge, the former head of the DHS. So this NewsGuard, this narrative guard, this entity that rates the news integrity of online outlets on the internet, which if you run a news site, you will surely know if you've been demonetized, if you can't get ad revenue, NewsGuard is probably the reason why. Behind this humble little news rating agency is the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, a four-star general, the head of NATO, the head of the censorship office at the State Department, and the head of Homeland Security, former.